So when the riot occurred, why Governor Romney asked for the troops after the state militia couldn't quite handle the whole business. And President Johnson made a big thing about Governor Romney. He was a little upset, but what Romney didn't understand was that the president was trying to make it all constitutional, was trying to make the federal assistance totally constitutional, which he did, pretty much. And then the riots were calmed down and all that sort of stuff. And what I knew was that I knew my colleagues, and they're all human beings, and they're all politicians, and I knew that there was a possibility, not a probability, but there was a possibility that they would move into these riots and start study committees and come in there like vultures and do no good. In other words, they could stir up a lot of stuff that was unnecessary to stir up, sawdust that didn't need to be sawed again, and so forth. So I devised, and I've never heard of this before, a coordinating committee. And this coordinating committee was adopted by both houses of the legislature. And Coleman Young was on the coordinating committee, and the leaders of both houses were on the coordinating committee. And that committee was given the power to coordinate all the legislation and all the study and all that stuff regarding to the riots. And it was given the power to order members and committees to cease and desist if they were doing something that we thought was inimical to the peace of the community. And we didn't need to do anything more than just pass that thing to get everybody to be careful. And so it worked out very well. But we had several meetings, and this really endeared Coleman Young to me a lot, because we were good friends from then on. We were always okay friends, but he was really impressed with that. So then we embarked on a deal of open housing, and Governor Romney called a special session on open housing. And we had a big, long session on open housing. We weren't able to pass a bill, but we were the next year, in 1968. We passed a bill on open housing. So those were very tough days, and we did have a House discussion group, which was a bipartisan discussion group. Mel DeStigter was on it. He was chairman of the Civil Rights Committee. And this was discussion with the Black Caucus and all that stuff, the kinds of things that we should do to ameliorate what happened and prevent anything like this from the future.
And in 68, the Democrats again took control.
On the election of 68, right.
And Bill Ryan became Speaker.
Right.
And then you became Minority Leader.
Yeah, I became Minority Leader, and for the first time in the history of Michigan, I do believe that they had a Minority Floor Leader and a Minority Leader that were separate. Bill Hampton had been my Majority Floor Leader. I didn't want both jobs anyway, and so we split them into two.
What happened under the Ryan speakership in terms of?
Well, the worst thing that happened was under my speakership. Well, and that was, these guys got together in their inimitable pusillanimity. That'll throw anybody listening to this.
Including me.
Well, that means cowardly.
For some reason I was thinking cheap.
Well, it was close. Cheap too. Anyway, they put this State Officers Compensation Commission on the ballot in the primary election of 1968, which I think is one of the most fascinating case studies of political duplicity that I've ever read in my life. And they did it at the end of a newspaper strike that had been going on for months, and they knew that the press wouldn't be able to analyze the thing in the metropolitan area. And they knew that the public, once they said, well, do you think the legislature ought to set their own salaries, would say, no, we think that they shouldn't do that. But the public, not knowing that the legislature didn't dare give themselves a raise, and that we were much safer in the hands of the legislature than we were in a bunch of people who were beholden to the legislature and appointed by the governor and so forth. And then the legislature sort of carefully left out a couple so they could ratchet it. Oh, it was a mess. But that was the beginning of the full-time legislature.
And the growth in staff.
Right, and that was the beginning of the whole business.
Lengthening of the sessions.
Yeah, and this had been going on during the decade to a degree. Bobby Traxler was in the vanguard along with Spencer,
Roy Spencer.
Roy Spencer. And they had the bipartisan counterparts in the Senate. And I've checked this whole thing out. I've written on it, and I've had it checked out with people that were there, so my stuff is pretty objective. And it was done to do just exactly what it did, is to move into a full-time legislature. And that's what we have now, and that's destroyed pretty much the collegiality of the legislature, the closeness that I told you that Al Horrigan and I had, Joe Kowalski and I had. It used to be that there weren't any multi-client lobbyists, and I think the multi-client lobbyists is really, you know, they're not illegal, but they're not very helpful. We have a system now where there's a fundraiser almost every night.
That's true.
In this town, and you learn how to go to you learn how to put on a fundraiser before you learn where the latrine is, and that's not a good thing. And when you go to a fundraiser, it's usually partisan. The lobbyists are there, but there are not very many people of the other party there, and there's some, but there's not very many. And it used to be that our extracurricular stuff was almost always on a bipartisan basis. I mean, we'd go out to dinner with the American Petroleum Institute would send somebody out. You'd take a group out to dinner. You'd take 2 or 3 Democrats and 2 or 3 Republicans. You'd all have a good time, and there'd be a collegiality there. You'd discuss the issues of the day, and you wouldn't do it and trying to do a one-upsman on the one or the other.
But there were partisan hangouts. As I recall, the Democrats hung out at the Capitol Park, or at least the labor. The labor guys had a place to hang out, and then
that's true. But there was there was some of that, and quite a bit of that. But there was a lot more mixing than there is today, and I think that. When you have too much staff, now we didn't have enough staff, but there's a happy medium. But when you have too much, well, it sort of screens the legislators from each other.
That's a good point.
And I think that in your lobbying right now, you find that very often you have to go in to talk to the staff guy. You don't always talk to the legislator.
That's right.
Now, that was impossible in my time. You have to talk to me or nobody. You'll whistle for a while.
You've also talked in the past to me about the growth of the budget of the legislature and the amount of state dollars that are spent by the legislative branch, as opposed to your tenure.
Oh, I've forgotten what it was, but it's grown up 10 or 15, 20, 30 times. It's just huge. Well, look at the stuff they've got now. And so I think of the clerk and his secretary are now replaced by 2 clerks and a whole flock of secretaries and finance people, and they also have something called a bill analysis, which and you've looked those over, I'm sure. And the guys that do the analyzing don't have the political background for the political nuances